All right. So, yes. Huh. It was on Schoology when I just looked now. Let's take a look after the notes today. So, for today, let's take a look at our structure again. Let's remind ourselves where we've been and where we're going. We started out by looking at cosmology. We took a look to see if when we actually look out into space and in the universe and in our solar system, if things actually look the billions of years old that they're supposed to, if the Big Bang is actually true. They don't. And because things don't look that old, they look much younger, thousands of years old, the entire structure of the naturalistic philosophy just crumbles all over itself. Because without that amount of time, you don't have enough time for the origin of life to come from non-life. And you don't have time for the genetic code to code for itself, and so on. But if you remember what we did is we said, okay, let's pretend that there are really billions of years of time to work with here. We're going to assume the Big Bang is true. Let's take a look at the origin of life and see if given that amount of time, we actually have a plausible way that life can spring from non-life. And as you knew from the last chapter, that turned out not to be the case. Doesn't matter how long you give it, you're not going to get life springing from non-life. You're not going to get the building blocks of life springing from non-life or anything in the past. So, we are headed next to genetics and DNA here. So we'll highlight that, and you can write that in your notes. As you do so, we're going to change our background.
Can you repeat that? I didn't get to see it.
All right, we'll do the transition again. Here we go. So there's the old one. And now we're going to genetics and DNA. You can see the, right? You can see the double helix structure in the background there. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. So what we look at now is we are going to say, okay, let's pretend the Big Bang happened. Let's pretend you've got billions of years to work with. Let's also pretend that life can spontaneously arise from non-life. If all of that is true, is it possible for the genetic code in these simple organisms to program itself to the point where you see the entire variety of plants and animals in our world today? So yeah, genetics and DNA. If you haven't written it down already, there it is. Just like the previous sections, anytime you see a quote that is unattributed to anybody, it will be attributed to, thank you, this guy in this case, Dr. Rob Carter, PhD marine biology. He has a lot of interesting things to say in the field of genetics and DNA. So, why do you kind of look like your parents? Well, up until the 1800s, everybody thought that the reason you looked sort of like your mom and dad is because of blended inheritance. Everybody believed that you were just kind of a combination of the different characteristics of your parents. Like let's say hair color. Maybe your dad is just super blonde and your mom has very dark black hair. If you combine them, maybe you get a brownish color. So they would say that's why you have brown hair when you come out after they have you. So this was the prevalent idea that it was just kind of a blending of these characteristics, an average of these characteristics, and that was the predominant idea up into the 1800s. It wasn't until Gregor Mendel came along that we found out how these things actually work. So sometimes it does appear that, you are an average of your parents, whether you're talking about characteristics of their ears or their skin color or their hair color or their height. It can appear that way, but what determines how you look and your height and your weight and all that has to do with individual traits from your parents. It's not a blending, it's not a mixing. And that was a real big, important step in the process of discovering what all this genetic information was about. And Gregor Mendel, when he first came up with this idea, nobody believed him. And yet by taking biology, that Gregor Mendel really laid the foundation for what we know today as modern genetics. On the other side of that coin, though, was Darwin. And you can write this whole thing down. I think that's from another classroom. Nice thing about this font is sometimes it looks like there's a lot up here, but it really spreads it out horizontally, so it's not as bad as it looks for some of these slides. So as you finish writing this, just as a heads up, the stuff in the last chapter in The Origin of Life, that's the most abstract stuff that we do in this class. You know, you can talk all day about amino acids and RNA and proteins, but you never see these things yourself in the real world, right? So it's tough to kind of wrap your mind around some of the concepts from the last chapter. The rubber really starts to hit the road in this chapter, and we start to see how genetics and DNA really do point to not just creation, but to the biblical version of history. And it's really fun to see, and we start that journey today. I'm looking forward to it. So Darwin thought that the reason you look like your parents was something he termed as pangenesis. He believed that learned traits can be passed on to your offspring. Now, when I say learned traits here, I don't mean like, okay, you're kind of naturally a good musician, and your spouse is naturally a good musician, so then chances are you'll have a better shot at your kids being better, you know, on the piano or something.
He lost his shadow. He lost his student.
Oh, no.
So he went to the bathroom.
Okay.
No, Tyrone lost his shadow. I thought he went here. He came out of the office.
No.
One job. One job.
Well, we're glad you found your way
We
here.
found him.
All right. Well, that was unplanned. That's fun. So, anyway, when we're talking about these traits, and like athletic ability too, if you're a really good athlete, if you're a super fast runner, and you marry someone who's a super fast runner, you're probably going to have kids that are better able to use those abilities and become faster runners. That can be through genetics. But what Darwin believed is different from that. He believes learned traits could be passed on. So he would say, you know, something like, maybe you haven't worked out in a while. And you really want to have a child who has really strong upper body strength. So Darwin would say what you ought to do then is you really ought to hit the gym for about 3 months to get yourself nice and strong before you hit the bedroom and try and conceive. So that would be the idea here. So that these learned traits that you develop over time can be passed on through the genetics to your children. And that was the idea. And it's not just physical things either. He believed things like, if, let's say you wanted your child to be really good at math, well, then you better try and brush up on your multiplication tables before, you try and conceive. That sort of thing. So, though it sort of doesn't make sense, but you can see how someone might believe that. He would believe that, the reason that giraffes got their longer necks is because, these horse-like creatures were reaching up to try and grab these leaves, and so over time their necks stretched up a little bit. And so after a couple of years, this one horse-like creature had a neck a little bit bigger than the other horse-like creatures. And so then it passed that learned trait, because it stretched it out over time, like yoga or something. And those traits got passed on to their giraffe kids and their giraffe kids, and next thing you know, you had necks that were 10 feet long. And that's what pangenesis is all about, learned traits. Of course, in reality, we know this is not something that's for real. You cannot pass on learned abilities to your kids. But like I mentioned in the beginning, anything you have a natural inclination for, like me personally, the only thing that really academically came easy for me is spelling. I was never really naturally good at math or language or writing or reading, but spelling was that was my thing. So chances are, because that came naturally to me, my kids might be really good spellers. But just because I learned all this physics and all this astronomy over the last 20 years doesn't mean my kids are going to be naturally better at those. And you can see why his theory of evolution would assume this. It would supercharge that theory. If somehow having a super strong right arm would make you, really fit in your environment, and you could just bulk up in your right arm, then according to his idea, then your son or daughter would have automatically a really strong right arm. And so if you kind of take that over a period of time, like with the giraffe example, you can see how that would cause lots and lots of changes in a very short period of time. And so that was really the draw to this theory being a part of his idea of natural selection. So again, it would sort of supercharge his theory of evolution. And we'll get into that theory more in the next section. You don't have to write anything down here, but just a couple things we have to make sure that we're clear on. So DNA is the carrier of heredity. That's the instruction manual that makes you the way you are. You can think of it just like you get an instruction manual for setting up an entertainment center. That's basically the role of DNA. All those letters in your DNA kind of correspond to the letters in an instruction manual that you would read. It tells your body exactly how to look the way it looks and how to function the way it functions, both on the inside and on the outside. Yes? Sure. Your DNA letters are grouped into genes that code to make a specific part of you. So it's not one DNA letter that tells your ear how to look, or one DNA letter that tells your hair what color to be. Those are part of bigger structures called genes that make those determinations. And they determine ear size, eye color, literally everything about yourself. There are about 3 billion DNA letters in the human genome. The actual number is just a little bit bigger than that. And about 20,000 genes. And those genes are what determine your physical characteristics. And all that information on how to build you is compacted into a cell nucleus which is 5 micrometers across. Now, it's tough to comprehend how small 5 micrometers is. So, the way I'll visualize it for you is if you imagine yanking out a strand of your hair. The width of your hair, on average in a human, is about 100 micrometers. Okay? So if you cut that into 20 pieces, That's about what 5 micrometers would be. And all of your DNA code, all 3 billion letters, 20,000 genes are present in that tiny area. You can write all of this down, though. We'll be spending a lot of time on this slide. You don't need to draw these lines and squiggles. So when you hear mutations, a lot of times people think of them as a good thing, right? That's how the X-Men get their powers. That's how Spider-Man gets his powers. And the Incredible Hulk. So DNA copy errors are what mutations are. That's all a mutation is. DNA are those 3 billion letters in your genetic code, and those can build up errors in them as your cells replicate. Because as your cells, here's the thing, cells in your body do not last forever. I think I've heard that every 7 years you're actually a completely different person because almost all of your cells by that time have died and been replaced. So cells do not last forever, and so they have to replicate themselves so that you don't die along with them. And when they replicate themselves, they replicate your genetic code, your DNA. Well, in that copying process, you get errors, you get corruptions. Just like if you take the copy of an instruction manual and you copy it, and you copy it, and you copy it. Because that's what's happening as your cells copy themselves over and over and over again as you age. And so in the same way, these errors build up over time. And that's what mutations are. They're just errors in your genetic code. That's nothing that's going to give you a superpower. Mutations in your parents' DNA that they've accumulated over time can be passed on to you. You get half your DNA from your mom and half of your DNA from your dad. So if you look at this little chart of squiggles and lines over here, we'll start to give this meaning. Let's say that the left side are the genes and the genetic information that you get from your mom, and the right side are the genes and the genetic information from your dad. The lines that aren't squiggly represent parts of your genetic code that are just fine. They haven't been mutated, they haven't been corrupted. So when they come together to make you, you're going to be just fine for whatever that gene is coding for. Now, maybe your mom has a mutation in a gene here, but your dad does not. This is simply saying that when that occurs, the good gene from your dad will cover over the bad gene in your mom, and you're not going to show any visible birth defects from that. But you will become a carrier. So whatever that would correspond to in your mother's genetic code, you would be carrying the possibility that you could pass that on to your kids. Again, here, everything's fine, everything's fine. Let's go down here for a sec. So again, on this one, your dad has a defective gene, but that's going to be covered up by the good gene from your mother, and everything will be just fine. But of course, the question is then, what happens when you encounter a gene from your mom and your dad that are mutated in the same location? That's where you get genetic diseases from. Hereditary diseases include things like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, color blindness, Alzheimer's. That's why as you get older and you go to the doctor, they're going to always ask you if you have a lot of those things in your family history. Do you have any diabetes in your family history? Do you have any heart disease or cancer? And you'll be asked that a lot as you get older. And so that's what's happening here. If you have both of those genes that are defective matching up, you're going to have some errors as your body is being created inside your mother on account of those corrupted instructions in your instruction manual. Yeah? Exactly. They could just be a carrier. But if you have kids and then that gene from you matches up with a bad gene from your wife, then yeah, things can happen. And it's more complicated than that. You guys have used Punnett squares, and it does get a little bit more complicated, but that's the main idea here. So here's the thing then. When we're dealing with this type of a setup, who do you suppose is going to have a genetic code similar to your own? Your brother and your parents and family members. This is why it's bad, not just in a gross way. This is why it's bad to marry and have kids with family members, because you have the same mutations in the same areas. So you're probably going to have kids that have all sorts of birth defects. This is what happened in the Middle Ages when people tried to keep the royal lineage in the family. So they had kids with family members, and those kids ended up being all messed up for this exact reason. Now, I want to take this one step further. Anybody know what was happening in... We'll do Cain's wife first here. So, anybody know who Cain's wife was? First off, Adam and Eve.
His sister.
Yep, Adam and Eve had kids, Cain and Abel. We know what happened to those two. Cain lived on and eventually got married and had kids. But because he was the son of Adam and Eve, the only other people around were his family members, were his sisters. Why do you suppose he and his wife didn't have any kids with visible birth defects? I mean, they lived to like 900 or whatever. Exactly. How many mutations do you suppose God made Adam and Eve with?
0.
0. So it wasn't until the fall happened that these mutations began accumulating. And it's not like they were just, a waterfall of mutations here all at once. You probably had one mutation in Cain's DNA or something like that. Over 3 billion DNA letters and 20,000 genes. So even if back then you would marry your sister, which you had to marry family members back then, and it sounds gross now, but that's just the way it was. You didn't have to worry about this. However, if you really know your Old Testament, anybody know what was happening in Leviticus 18?
Was that when Lot and his daughters did their thing?
Nope, good guess. That's a bit earlier. Leviticus 18 is when Moses was taking the Israelites in the desert, and they were waiting for God to lead them to the promised land. And while that was happening, God says, "Hey, Israelites, you can't marry your family members anymore." Why do you suppose God said that?
Because they were getting too muted.
Yeah. So, go ahead. This occurred a full 3,500 years after creation. So over those 3,500 years, you have plenty of time for these mutations to accumulate and start affecting you if you start, making babies with your family members. And so put yourself for a second in the shoes of an Israelite back then, all right? So up until this point, God has been okay with people marrying their family members. But all of a sudden now, God says, no, you can't do that anymore. In your Israelite mind, you're probably thinking, God, why did you change your mind? What is different about this whole thing? How could I make sense of what God is doing? They had no idea. And yet now, having the benefit of thousands of years of hindsight, we know exactly what was going on here. I think it was 3,500 years after creation. Might have been a little bit less than that. But anyway, so with the benefit of hindsight, we know this is probably why God did that, because these mutations were accumulating and he was looking out for his people. So I say this because how often in life are we, how often are we looking at what God has done for us and looking at the scenarios we're in, and we say, God, what could you possibly be thinking? Why didn't I get that job? Why didn't I get into that school? Why did I get turned down for prom? What could you possibly be thinking up there? When in reality, we have to remember, God knows a lot better than us. And not just better than us, not just wiser than us, he knows a lot more than us. And chances are you're not going to be able to see exactly what God is thinking until you also have the benefit of years of hindsight. So keep that in mind. Whenever it comes to a point in your life where you're like, God, what could you possibly be thinking? How could you possibly be looking out for my benefit when this happened to me? He's got something better in mind. I know every time that I've come across something like that, and I look back, I automatically think, wow, I'm sure glad, Lord, that you're in charge of what's going on in my life and not me, because you know better. Yes. Yes. Okay, moving onward. And this is basically what we were talking about in the previous slide there. Okay, from this, please write down the start of the last sentence here. Curious if we can figure out what it's going to say.
That's basically what it's.
The ultimate puzzle of life is not the complexity of the molecules upon which life depends. It is not the complex arrangement of the parts living organisms use. No, the ultimate puzzle of life is, what do you think? What's that? Living?
The ultimate puzzle of life is life.
Okay. We're going to go a little bit deeper than that. You're not wrong. The ultimate puzzle of life is the origin of the information upon which life is based. Write that down to finish off your sentence. We talked about this a little bit in the previous chapter when we were dealing with information. Genetic code has lots and lots and lots of information in it. And it's not so much the DNA molecule that's the miracle of life. The real miracle of life is the information that's inside of it, that it has a purpose and a function. That's going to bear out in this chapter as well. And you'll see that on a deeper scale here. I love those transitions. Let's do that again. All right, here we go.
Wait, stay.
Did I show you guys the video of my son and I when we did that? I would tell him to stay on one end of the room. Then I'd tell him to come get me, and he'd give me a big hug running across the room. I'll have to show you that. It's super adorable. All right, here we go. From this slide, please write down this bullet point right here and that sub-bullet point below it. Yep. So these three lines, bang, bang, bang.